I think we can start now. I'll begin by introducing you so that we do not, I think that we have quite a number of people already online. And I first of all want to welcome Professor Ogunnaike to this platform that we've been using, during the COVID, but also a little bit before that as well. We've had this ongoing meeting. In fact, before COVID, we were struggling to get the right medium, to get the right technology for this. And so this was, in a sense, a kind of a boon to us. And we've been having this conversation every month for the last 2 years or more. So it's a really great pleasure for us to host you particularly on talking about Sufi ethics in West Africa, and also this particular text, translation that you shared with us, but also the work that you are going to do today in terms of how it is used as such. I think that's something that we're really looking forward to. But for those of you who do not know Professor Ogunnaike, I think we have sent a short biography, but I would like to pick up from there, specifically that you're a graduate of Harvard University. You've spent a bit of time in a few other universities. I'm not going to remember them immediately, but anyway, I think that now at UVA. So you're at UVA in Charlottesville, or are you in UVA in Charlottesville, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And what I also think your work stands out, apart from an in-depth study of the Tasawwuf, is also the link between the Tasawwuf Sufism in West Africa, not as a kind of an outpost that is very different from what is going on in the history of Islam or the rest of the Muslim world. In addition to that, I think your work also brings in the spiritualities of the Ife tradition, Nigerian tradition. And that I think I really sort of congratulate you for doing that, but also think that it is quite a difficult task, to think about bringing in traditions that have different histories and different contexts wherein they developed. But I think your work that I've seen, the book that I've seen, I think does that particularly well. And I think that's really an interesting way that we do that. I mean, that's one of the struggles that we have whenever we have a discussion about, say, Islam and Christianity separately. We have different kind of conversation when we actually bring them together. And I think the skill is basically to be an expert in both of them, which is quite a challenging task. So I think that your work stands out for that. And thank you very much, and also congratulations for doing that. And I hope to see more of your work, developing those kind of both in-depth studies in one, but also a comparative study as well, in the way that you've done it on the Ife, on the ways of seeing as such. So without further ado, let me ask you to present your lecture today on the text as well as the West African, the Niasse tradition in particular, and then we'll have a period of time for quick comments and discussions.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Tayo, for the introduction. Thank you to the University of Cape Town for hosting me virtually. It's my honor and privilege to be with you today to speak about this wonderful text, really kind of a contemporary classic of Sufi ethics and tarbiya, spiritual training, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's maqāmāt, al-dīn, al-thalāth, the 3 stations of religion. It's a little embarrassing for me to be speaking to you today when we have major experts in this tradition in the audience, including my own kind of mentors, Professor Brigalia, Professor Wright here as well. But that's good. If I get anything wrong, they'll be here to correct me, so you guys will be sure you'll get the right answers, the correct information about all of this. So this, as you saw, there's an article that's in an edited volume on Sufism and ethics published by the American University of Beirut that was circulated. I gave an Arabic title to this talk as well too, in the kind of tradition of rhyming titles, Fatihul Akhlaq wa Kashif and Tarbiyat al-Akhlaq and the Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. That's the undoing of knots, of locks, and the unveiling of confusion or lifting of confusion on tarbiya, the training of ethics with Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. So one particular difficulty in discussing Sufi ethics in general in the Western Academy is that, as I'll argue throughout this presentation and in the article, In Sufi ethics, the ethics is not separated from epistemology, which is from knowledge, nor is it separated from ontology, which is a being. Whereas I don't think this is a Western versus non-Western kind of thing. I think if you look at the kind of origins of the Western academic tradition, Socrates in particular argues that knowledge is virtue, that someone who knows the good is good, which from a contemporary point of view, obviously we know you can know ethics and be a jerk. You can know all of the ethical theories. You can have read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, know it backwards and forwards, and still not behave well. But I think that the key to understanding both the kind of ancient philosophical traditions as well as Sufi ethics is precisely this union of ethics, epistemology, and ontology. In Ibn Arabi's formulation, playing on the root wajada, from which wujud, being, comes, as well as wijdan, finding, consciousness, and ecstasy, wajd, he says, being amongst the folk, that is the Sufis, is finding the real in ecstasy. So here we have a kind of marriage of tahaqquk, spiritual realization, and takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, virtue, an acquisition of virtue, of divine character traits. So knowledge, the height of knowledge is really knowledge as a mode of being, of realization. And that ideal mode of being is identical with a virtuous being. And so this is what I think Socrates was getting at in the way he describes Sophia and wisdom, and what the Sufis, at least, but probably before Ibn al-Arabi as well, have been talking about when they discuss marifa, and the ethical, not only requirements for marifa, direct knowledge of God, but the ethical implications of marifa, how someone with marifa acts and is in the world. So we'll basically, the rest of this talk will be kind of a commentary on that main argument or insight. So as Professor Tayyub mentioned, my work is mainly on Sufism in contemporary West Africa. The Pew Charitable Trust did a study in 2014, finding that Sufism is more popular in West Africa than any other region of the world, with a staggering 92% of Senegalese Muslims claiming affiliation to a Sufi order, Chad 55, Cameroon 48, Ghana and Nigeria about 37. You can see this completely dwarfs other areas of the world. So when speaking about West African Islam, Sufism is really central. And within West Africa, by far the most popular Sufi order is that of the Tijaniya, founded by Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, who was originally from the Algerian, what's today Algeria, but settled and lived in what's now Fez, died in 1815. Professor Wright has two wonderful books on his life and works, who founded the Tariqa Tijaniya, which has since spread and become the most popular order on the continent of Africa as a whole, particularly in West Africa, and perhaps even the most popular order worldwide. This is in large part due to the efforts of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, pictured here, who died in 1975, who brought what's called the Faida to Tijaniya, this flood, which was prophesied in certain Tijani circles, which would bring people into the Tijani order and to Marifatullah, direct knowledge of God, in numbers never seen before. Now, this Faida is characterized by this process of tarbiya, which is a method of spiritual training that's meant to bring aspirants to fana, annihilation in God, and marifa, direct knowledge of God, more swiftly and easily than other methods of spiritual training. And because of this particular method of tarbiya, within the Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's branch of the Tijaniya, the order has spread like wildfire, particularly Niasse's sub-branch, from its kind of center in West Africa, across the continent. There are zawiyas in South Africa now, in Europe, throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia, North America, South America, every continent except for Antarctica. I don't know what the penguins are doing, but every other continent you have major zawaya centers and lots of disciples within this particular order. Some current estimates put the number of disciples at over 100 million disciples throughout the African continent, as well as the diaspora and other regions, like I said, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So to give you a kind of sense of this, in Nigeria, for Sheikh Ibrahim's birthday, it's very common for cities to shut down, particularly in northern Nigeria. So this is in Sokoto. So stadiums, Niasse's disciples and lovers and fans regularly fill stadiums in Nigeria. So we're talking about a very large movement here. Also, as Professor Tayob mentioned, kind of as an aside, one of the things that movements like Niasse's show us is that West Africa is not a kind of peripheral outpost in the Muslim world. As Rudolf Ware and others have argued, West Africa is a center of Islamic scholarship, of Islamic spiritual influence, knowledge production. Because it's on the quote-unquote periphery geographically does not mean it's on the periphery in terms of scholarship, knowledge, religious leadership. The distance in terms of sanad between West African communities and the initial Muslim community is no longer than the distance in sanad between communities in the Middle East and the original Muslim community of the Prophet and his companions. That is, when you look at traditional Islamic disciplines, your distance from the distance is measured not by geographical distance, but rather by distance in chains of transmission. So hadith scholars are often looking for the shortest links to in their chains of transmission. And West Africa, looking at it in this sense, or Southeast Asia, or other regions, we shouldn't be fooled by the kind of geography. What really determines distance is these chains of initiation. And when that West Africa is in transmission, that West Africa is no further away or no more peripheral than people in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia. In fact, some scholars like Rudolf Ware even make the opposite argument, that it's closer for reasons of certain reasons of colonial exigencies. All right. Sorry, I'm going through that. Okay, so now this text that I presented, I want to discuss today, comes out of a particular genre of kind of Sufi ethical development literature called the maqāmāt literature, or the manazil genre, which lays out the different stages of human development, human ethical perfection, starting from where most of us are to the highest level of sanctity and human perfection. It's a very, very long history, going back to the earliest, some of the earliest examples of Sufi literature. Abu Talib al-Makki's Qult al-Qulub, Abu Yazid al-Bastami mentions, a very early Sufi mentions this different maqāms. Hujwiri wrote the first treatise, Sufi treatise in Persian, mentions it. Qushayri, Solami, Ansari, these very early, usually 10th, 11th century Sufi writers all describe these different maqāms, these different stages along the path to the perfection of the human soul. And they describe these stations as spiritual, epistemo, ethical, onto-psychological. That is, they refer to the spiritual states, the states of knowledge that characterize being in the states, ethical states, the mode of being, as well as the psychological experiences of people occupying these states. Sometimes these states are subdivided up into more stages, manazil, literally meaning halting places, sometimes called mawaqif. And these literature often describes the ahwal, the psycho-spiritual states of aspirants during their evolution in pursuit of the Prophet's exalted example. So these states essentially, this genre describes the process of becoming fully human with extensive reference to the Quran and Hadith and earlier Sufi tradition. In general, higher maqams are said to include the lower, and these achieving a maqam is described often as the actualization of inherent potentialities within a person, and or at other times described as acquiring disposition. But as I go into in the article, if you look closely, it's much more complicated than it seems at first. It's not just step 1, step 2, step 3, then you're perfect. These authors are being spiritual masters themselves and having gone through some of these stages themselves, they're well aware of how messy human life can be. So Ibn Arabi has in many things kind of changed the game when he came along, and his description of maqāmāt was found primarily in his Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, but also in other works, provides a nice summary of earlier Sufi theories, and his characterization came to characterize later Sufi theories as well. So in Ibn Arabi's account, as in many other accounts, these stages are based upon the verse of the Quran: if you love God, then follow me, God will love you. And so the whole process of ascending through the different maqāms, the different stations of spiritual realization, are described as following the Prophet and trying to the best of one's ability, assimilate oneself to his tremendous character, khuluqun azim. And Ibn Arabi identifies this with being characterized by the character traits of God, takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, famous statements from the Hadith and Sufism. In fact, he defines Sufism as this. Sufism is simply acquiring the divine character traits, which he says are the Prophet's traits. And he connects this to this Hadith Nawafil, which is the famous Hadith of my servant doesn't cease drawing nearer to me through supererogatory actions until I love him. Notice the connection with love there. God will love you. What happens when God loves you becomes the hand with which you grasp, the foot with which you walk, the sight with which you see, the hearing with which you hear. So in this state of being identified with the Prophet's traits, which are then identified with the divine traits, this is the kind of goal of human perfection. And so he equates tahaqquk, spiritual realization, with takhalluq, which with acquiring these traits. And epistemically, he interestingly calls this tahayyur. This is bewilderment. He says this kind of bewilderment is the true knowledge. There's no goal beyond it. The blind man and the seeing are liking it, for it joins the furthest things with the nearest and brings together the lowest and the most high. This is a bit confusing, but I think if we keep going, we'll understand why he equates this highest degree of knowledge with bewilderment. So Ibn Arabi characterizes, uses the verse of Quran and says everything has its known station, maqām ma'lūm, and a secure station, maqām amin. He contrasts this to the maqām mahmud of the Prophet described in Surah Al-Isra by describing the Prophet's station as being a kind of station of no station, a station that transcends all stations. And this maqām la maqām he takes from a verse about the people of Medina, people of Yathrib. So, O people of Yathrib, you have no standing, la muqam, so return. And he says this station, having a station is to be limited to a particular level, but the real perfection is to not be limited by any level. So he connects this with the Prophet's Quranic prayer, Rabbi zidni ilman, God increase me in knowledge, which he also equates to another prayer from the Hadith, God, please increase me in bewilderment upon you. So he says this station of no station is a station of perpetual motion through the stations, of perpetually increasing in knowledge. It's not a static state, it's a state that's in perpetual motion. And because it's in perpetual motion and it's not fixed, it's like bewilderment. To know something definitely and certainly without bewilderment is to have a fixed idea about it. This kind of enlightened bewilderment is a perpetual motion. So he compares this with the divine side, the kind of divine counterpart on this with this verse of the Quran. God is constantly upon a new affair, constantly radiating out something new. And the Prophet's station is one of perfect receptivity to that. So every day, the Prophet and those who follow in his path are upon a new affair as well. So this represents the transcendence of fixed limitations and stations in perpetual transformation, a kind of formless, fathomless perfection. And he calls the people who have achieved this Muhammadans, and says that this is the state of those people who have achieved human perfection, using this phrase that God in the Quran says, we've created man upon the ahsan taqweem, the best of forms, which Ibn Arabi identifies as tamkeen fi talweem, which is stability in perpetual change. So to give you a kind of poetic example of this, there's this wonderful verse from the board, which you can see here. فَإِنَّ فَضْلُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لَيْسَ لَهُ حَدٌ فَيُعْرِبُ عَنْهُ نَاطِقٌ بِفَمِهِ. So the virtues of the Messenger of God have no limit that can be expressed by the speaking logical that can be expressed by speech, elaborated by the mouth. So the Prophet is understood to occupy this kind of transcendent station of no station. Ibn Arabi comments upon this station of no station in his Futuhat, saying the highest of all human beings are those who have no station. The reason for this is that the stations determine the properties of those who stand within them, but no doubt the highest of all groups themselves determine the properties. They're not determined by properties, since the real is identical to them insofar as he is the strongest of those who determine properties. Quran 95 there. So the best kind of metaphor I can give for this is it's as if the best color to have is not, let's say, blue or red, but rather what Ibn Arabi is kind of getting at, and you see this a little bit in the early Sufi tradition and much more after him, is the transcendence of color. That is kind of transparency, the ability to take on all colors. So if you met each color is, let's say, different stations. So you start out in red, then go through the rainbow all the way to violet. For Ibn Arabi, the completion, the perfection isn't a particular color, but rather the transcendence of all colors, the ability to take on any color depending on the situation. Now, these texts, as I've kind of mentioned in discussion, weren't used so much as just the kind of thing that you read about. I say that they're kind of more like a GPS than a map. You use your GPS when you're actually driving or going somewhere. So they're used by people engaged in the process themselves. It's not something that you kind of look at as a passive observer. They're used by people who are involved in the very processes they're describing, and they're meant to be used and taught like this. And this is, I think, really helpful for understanding what's going on in this maqāmāt genre. They're meant to provide inspiration and guidance for people going through these processes, to provide understanding and reassurance for people going through the processes, but also they're meant to give you a kind of orientation, though they're not meant to necessarily be deterministic of what's going on. That is, they're always kind of meant to be heuristic. This is a rough guide of what's going on, what can happen, and nearly every single one of these works in the maqāmāt literature I've looked at always has some kind of disclaimer. Some people can jump ahead to a station and then they fall back and then go to another one. And as we'll see, the path is described not as a linear kind of stair step, but because of this idea of station of no station, it's often described as a circling or spiraling path, as we'll see in Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's work. So this particular work was written in response to a disciple, Umar ibn Malik's question. This disciple had read this work of Tijani training, one of these kind of maqāmāt works called the Mizab al-Rahma, a 19th century work, and he was confused about some things. So he wrote to Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, and Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse responded with this letter that is the treatise that was translated in the article that this talk is based on. Now, this treatise, this earlier treatise, 19th century treatise, in turn was based upon an earlier Andalusian North African scholars, Muhammad al-Ansari al-Sahili, his Bughyat al-Salik fi Ashraf al-Masalik, which describes the method of spiritual training by khalwa, by taking khalwas, and in taking these different khalwas, you go through these different stages. Now, this Tijani scholar, Ibn Nambuja, took this kind of model of basing things on this hadith of Jibreel, Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, and these different stages within that, and modified it to describe training in the Tariqa Tijaniya, which he describes as training through the wird, the daily litany, the 5 prayers, and particularly recitation of Salat al-Fatih. And the goal of this he describes as being knowledge of the Muhammadan reality. So Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse took this treatise, kind of summarized its essence and put his own spin on it to create this, his treatise, his letter, the 3 stations of religion. Now, each station, maqam, is based on one of these fundamental principles or 3 dimensions of the Islamic tradition found in the Hadith Jibreel of Islam: submission, Iman, belief or faith, and Ihsan, excellence, perfection. And then he further subdivides each station into 3 stages, manazil. So starting out first with at-tawbah, repentance, istiqamah, righteousness, uprightness, at-taqwa, mindfulness, God-fearingness, conscientiousness. 4, al-tu'maninna, tranquility. 5, as-sidq, sincerity. 6, al-ikhlas, pure devotion. 7, muraqabah, watchfulness. 8, al-mushahada, witnessing. 9, the last, al-ma'rifah, al-ihsan. And he divides each stage into different levels. So one level is for the common people, the next level is for the spiritual elite, a khasa, and the highest level is for the khasa to khasa. So essentially, but not every level, for example, there's not a common, not every level has all three. So as we'll see in this kind of massive diagram I have of all of the different stations. So from one point of view, you can see like the stations of Islam are included within the stations of Iman, which are included within the stations of Ihsan. From another level, looking at just kind of population, the common spiritual wayfarers, within them there's a special class of elite, and within them there's a special class of the elite in spiritual wayfaring. All right, so this is the kind of map, if we were to map out this treatise, this is kind of what it looks like. So we have Islam here, Iman here, the station of Iman, and the station of Ihsan here, each divided up into its three manazil, its three stages. So Tawbah, all the way through to Manina, to tranquility, has stages for the common, the elite, and the elite of the elite. But from tranquility onward, it's only for the elite and the elite of the elite. And from mushahada to ma'rifah, it's just for the khasa to khas, the elite of the elite. So he starts off by describing this path, this kind of spiraling path through spiritual perfection, because we start out with the common, go through kind of one cycle on the common, then go through as the elite, and then go through as the elite of the elites until you reach this kind of perfection. But even then, as we'll see, it's not a final journey, it's a kind of perpetual motion. But he starts off with the treatise by explaining these three stages, or these three stations, I should say, in terms of the meaning of La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God. So he says Islam is saying La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God. Iman, faith, belief, is knowing La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God. While Ihsan is actually realizing La ilaha illallah, or rather in another formulation, that God says La ilaha illallah, God says there's no God but God through you. He also describes this, or correlates this in terms of notions of Sufi cosmology connecting to these ideas of hadarat, which I don't have time to get into now, but perhaps we can get into in the Q&A. So let's go on the journey and see how it goes. So the first, starting out with the station of Tawbah. Tawbah is abandoning the forbidden, haram, for the obligatory, for the wajib. For the elite, the stage of Tawbah is abandoning the disliked for that of what's favored, typical legal categories here. Now, the Tawbah of the elite, which we'll come back to, which is perhaps the most confusing and interesting, is he quotes this verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, repent unto your creator and slay yourselves. And he says this level is not seen, and it's not seeing your soul as really having any state or station. And that is repentance from repentance, a tawbah min a tawbah. So we'll come back to that. Now, istiqamah, kind of uprightness, righteousness. For the common, it's being established on the straight path. And he quotes this verse of the Quran that describes the straight path, not associating others with God, not killing, being fair and just, a number of things. So he said, doing these things, not doing the things for prohibited, that's being upright, that's being righteous. For the elite, it's traveling on the straight path, which is the messenger of God, which means annihilation in him, loving him and adopting his character outwardly and inwardly, and remembering and invoking blessings upon and praying for him fervently and constantly. This is integrity, uprightness. So that's a very high bar right there. But that's not the end. For the elite of the elite, there's neither reticence nor grief. As God said, those who say our Lord is God and afterwards have integrity, istiqamah, uprightness, righteousness, the angels descend on them saying, fear not nor grieve, but hear good tidings of the paradise which ye are promised. Okay, now for the stage of taqwa, kind of mindfulness, conscientiousness, fear of God in the positive sense. For the common, he says, it's conforming to the commands absolutely and avoiding the prohibitions absolutely. This is the taqwa of the masses. For the elite, it's that they remember him and they do not forget him. They thank him and they're not ungrateful to him, and they obey him and they do not disobey him. And there are Quranic verses here to kind of substantiate all of these claims. And for the taqwa of the elite is the absence of any thoughts other than God in the mind, even for a moment. As the Noah al-Arif said, this is a verse of Ibn Farid, said, if a thought other than you occurred to me, even inadvertently, I would consider it as my apostasy. Says, well, this is the state of the complete knower, the Arif, the station of the unique comprehensive pole, this kind of pinnacle of degree in Sufi hagiography. Okay. So then now moving on to the station of Iman, we have sidq, or sincerity, which among the common is righteous action out of obedience for God's sake. And again, this is substantiated with Quranic verses that use the same roots of this term sidq. Then for the elite, it's loving the divine essence, and that union with it, with the divine essence, is more beloved to the aspirant than anything in existence. Its name is more beloved to him than any other name, and both of them are more beloved to him than all speech. And its pleasure is more beloved to him than all pleasure, and its beloved is more beloved to him than his beloved. So this is real sincerity. And for the elite of the elite, he said it's the confirmation, agreement with, tasdiq, of everything that the prophetic presence received from the divine in terms of knowledge, spiritual states, mysteries, comportments, the adab, rites and functions. For whoever's sincerity attains this level, his is the title of the truly sincere, as-siddiq. And again, this Quranic verse is kind of corroborating this. Now for the station of ikhlas, pure devotion. Here for the common, it's performing all the commands only for the sake of God, the generous, and likewise leaving the prohibitions. And wherever hypocrisy, concern for reputation, or self-satisfaction is found in the soul, that person is not truly devoted. That person is not mukhlisin. It's not among the mukhlisin. Now then, amongst the elite, it's doing all of these things not for the sake of reward, nor out of fear of punishment, nor for the sake of arriving at a spiritual station even, but rather it's acting out of pure servitude or ubudiyah and longing. Servitude or slavehood is acting for no other reason than that God is deserving of worship. We'll see here. So this is not, it's not a consequentialist ethic. It's not even a deontological ethic. It's something, some other kind of ethic is at work here. Now, the ikhlas of the elite is leaving aside all other than God and dealings with the real, and you yourself are other than God. So therefore, you see that actions are from God, to God, and by God, and you have no entrance to this and no exit from it. It's a famous saying by Shaykh Ahmed Tijani. So even the ethical self is removed at this level. It's just God. Now, moving on to the last stage of Iman, Tu'manina, tranquility or serenity, that of the elite. Tranquility of the heart by God, independence through God, certainty in God, and that nothing remains of the heart's turning towards what benefits the soul or harms it. Rather, it casts itself peacefully into the hands of God. And here it quotes the verse of Surah Fajr, Ya nafs al-mutma'inna, irji ila rabbika mardiyatan, return to your Lord, pleased and well-pleasing. And for the elite of the elite, there's certain knowledge that God alone exists, so there's no repose except in him and no return except to him. Now for the first of the stages of the station of ihsan, of excellence, which is now just for the elite and the elite of the elite, it's being that of muraqabah, of kind of watchfulness, is being perpetually present with God and knowing that he is aware of the totality of the servant. This fact never leaves his mind, because he sees the reality from behind a fine veil, and he understands with the understanding of taste, dhawq, direct experience. The possessor of the station may speak in such a way that one who has not attained perfect discrimination may think that he has arrived, but he has not yet arrived. That of the muraqabah is kind of observing of the breaths, which is this technical Sufi term for the kind of instant creation, recreation, and reabsorption of the world in the divine presence. And this occurs after achieving mushahada, witnessing, which is the next station. Oops, sorry. Do I get back here? There we go. All right, so mushahada, direct witnessing, is only for the elite of the elite. And Sheikh Ibrahim describes this as the vision of the truth, al-haq, by the truth, al-haq, the real, as it is, without doubt or uncertainty or fantasy. There only remains the truth by the truth, in the truth, and not one hair of the slave remains in existence. None arrive at this station except that he's been annihilated from his soul and from others and otherness, and on the tongue of his state is said, and this is a verse from Ibn Arabi, nothing remains except God and nothing other than him, and so no connection and no separation. As here, there is no name, no description, and no limit. This vision occurs without any how or definition or unification or direction or comparison or beginning or union or separation. Here, there's no invocation, dhikr, no invoker, dhakr, no invoked, madhkur, kind of absolute union. But that's not the end. There's another stage here, that of the marifa, which is only for the elite of the elite. And he describes it as the spirit being deeply rooted and firmly established in the presence of direct witnessing with complete annihilation in subsistence through God. So the knower, Arif, among the Sufis is the one who sees the other, the essence in the other, and he witnesses the truth, al-haq, in the other. He has this famous statement here describing other aspects of the tarbiya in his method. Said, for me, the knower is he who is annihilated in the essence once, and in the attribute twice or three times, and annihilated in the name once. He confirms the existence of these three realities, and he confirms the names by the name. And this stage, he says, is extremely difficult to reach. The possessor of this station is perfectly awake and aware of God and his wisdom and his commandments, and is satisfied with the unfolding of his degrees. Now this, as I say in here, is this sort of kind of references to Ibn Atala, famous Egyptian Shadli Sufis Hikam, who talks about the relationship of the traces and the names and this kind of going up to annihilation in the divine presence and then coming back from that. So he said, so the enraptured travelers, those who kind of experience ecstasy and are pulled, dragged along the spiritual path, the perfection of the divine essence is unveiled to them, and he makes them witness his attributes. Then he returns them to attachment to his names. Then he makes them witness his traces. And it's the reverse for the wayfarers, the salikun, those who are kind of marching on the path and not kind of pulled up. They start with the traces and then the names and then the attributes and the essence. And he said, so the end of the wayfarers is the beginning of the enraptured and vice versa. And the beginning of the wayfarers, the end of the raptures. So perhaps the two groups may meet on the path, those coming up and those going down. And Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse in the Tijani tradition in general has described the ideal being a combination of these two, of divine attraction and hard work, spiritual wayfaring, suluk, which is what we see here. So then Sheikh Ibrahim kind of ends the treatise saying, and knowledge is the last of the stations of religion, and repentance is its first. However, the reality of repentance is the absence of repentance, a tawbah. And this is only achieved through knowledge, marifa. In this regard, our Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, may God be pleased with him, used to say, by God, I have not reached the station of repentance, a tawbah. He, may God be pleased with him, meant that he had repented from seeing a tawbah. So as long as the slave regards himself, that is, sees his own self as being a thing that's in tawbah, he has not reached the true station of repentance, of tawbah. So this is the reality of tawbah described as a tawbah min a tawbah, in which you've kind of left yourself and all attributes of yourself behind, as we said here. So repent, integrate, and slay yourselves. So you can see it's rather complicated system, very subtle, kind of psychological, experiential, as well as ontological and epistemological analyses of what's going on in the soul of the aspirant as it follows this spiraling path towards perfection, which doesn't really have an end. As you can see, the beginning is in the end is in the beginning. Okay, so to kind of conclude briefly, the marifa ethics that I think are embodied in this treatise and many other treatises can't really be contained in or described accurately by popular academic paradigms, whether deontological, like Kantian law-based ethics, virtue ethics, as in the cultivation of particular virtues, or consequentialist ethics, which some people like to say, oh, Sufi ethics is all about achieving annihilation, or about this or that. I don't think it really fits into any of these categories as typically understood. And these categories, they're not universal categories, so I don't think we should try to shoehorn Sufi ethics into these or other frameworks. In the article I say, like, you can imagine if the geopolitics were different, we could describe Hume or Kant and their ethical theories as being more Ash'ari or Mu'tazili or Moist or Taoists. To take a closer look at how this works. So, for example, its description of ikhlas the ikhlas of the elite is not for the sake of reward or out of fear of punishment, nor for the sake of arriving at a spiritual station. So this is completely against kind of consequentialist ethical readings of Sufi or other ethics. When you get to these levels describing mushahada and other things, there's not rules, it doesn't really seem to follow deontological ethics, although deontological ethics, I think, does a good job describing in terms of adherence to the Sharia, those initial stages. And Sheikh Ibrahim never advocates leaving the Sharia at all, but something else is going on here that I don't think can be captured by deontological or law-based ethical paradigm. And even contra virtue ethics, it's not about the soul having particular qualities or developing particular virtues in the soul. It's in certain sense about leaving the soul behind, transcending the soul. And so this is, again, a distinct perspective to virtue ethics. So the ethical subject in this treatise and in other similar Sufi works is not a self-contained kind of liberal, rational, isolated, self-governing self. It's porous. There are outside influences. It exists in this cosmology with these forces and influences upon it that can drag it towards perfection or drag it towards the opposite. And as it goes through this process of perfection, it becomes more open and more open until it's eventually kind of gone, like a bubble popping. And then in a certain sense, it reemerges virtually. So there's this idea of that the ethical self itself is transformed, or it has different levels of reality, described often in the Sufi concept of maratib al-nafs, different levels of the soul. You have the nafs al-amara bisu, the soul that commands the evil, nafs al-lawama, the blaming soul, the kind of conscience, nafs al-mulhama, the inspired soul, the nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil soul, nafs al-radiya, the pleased soul, nafs al-mardiya, the pleasing soul, pleasing to God, and the nafs al-kamila, which kind of includes everything. So the ethical self that's at work here is not static, it's dynamic, and it's not just dynamic in the sense that it's improving itself, but the actual thing that's being improved is changing. It's becoming more open and kind of in a certain sense eventually disappearing or popping like a bubble, or its kind of substance is changing. So you can see what's going on here, or maybe why that's important. If you look at contrast this with Foucault's ethics or writings on ethics, which largely build on Kant's, in which he describes the 4 dimensions of the ethical self. So there's an ethical substance, which is the part of us that's concerned with moral conduct. You have a mode of subjectification, which is how we're incited to recognize our moral obligation. You have this kind of self-forming activity, which is how we transform ourselves into ethical subjects. And then there's the telos, which is what we aspire to be. And so he writes that ethics is the form that freedom takes when it is informed by reflection. So freedom consists for Foucault in reflectively informed ascetic practices or practices of the self. So I mean, so far so good. This description of freedom matches up very much with what Sheikh Ibrahim is describing, except as you go through these different stages, the ethical substance, the mode of subjectification, self-forming activity, those are all being transformed until eventually it's all God. And all of these things. And then in the article, I also, I call this an ethics of no ethics or transcendent ethics, pointing out some similar things you find in other traditions. The Taoist tradition has very similar statements and ideas about ethics. It seems Lao Tzu says highest virtue is not virtuous, and that's why it's virtuous. Zhuangzi says the perfect man has no self, the holy man has no merit, the sage has no fame. Marguerite Porete, in particular, says many things that are similar to this 14th century Christian mystic. Virtues, I take my leave of you forevermore. Now shall mine heart be more free and more in peace than it hath been ever before. Oh, then I was your servant, but now I'm delivered out of your thraldom. That's the service of virtues. So he said, so may not the virtues be against virtues? So she's not arguing against virtue, but rather above them. If this may not be, then God would be subject to his virtues. God is not subject to his virtues, he's above his virtues. And so what she's seeking in her kind of ethical path is that which is the source of the virtues. Early Sufi literature, you have this as well too. The famous Egyptian early Sufi, Dhul Nun al-Misri, says the final outcome of the knower is that he ends up being as he was, as he was before he was. Abdul Qadir Jilani, or more likely Yusuf al-Qurani, wrote that the one who reaches the limits of this path has neither form, nor shape, nor color. This can all kind of be summed up from the Hadith Nawafil, substituting some terms in, and you could say that in this perspective, God is the virtue through which the Sufi is virtuous. Now, it's a great story that appears in Ghazali and Rumi and Ibn Arabi and many other Sufi writers, which I think illustrates these different approaches to virtue. And it's the story of the two painters, the Greek painters and the Chinese painters. And in different versions of the story, the nationalities of the painters, the different strategies varies, but we'll just stick with the one I know best, which is this king invites two painters from two different nationalities, Greek and Chinese, gives them each a side of a room and says, all right, I would see who can make the most beautiful one. Whoever makes the most beautiful one will get all this treasure. So the Chinese painters go to work with painting, getting materials, getting gold, all of the stuff and decorating it, and it's so beautiful. The Greeks only ask for polishing cloth, and they just polish and polish and polish the marble of their side of the room. So the king comes and looks at the Chinese side of the room, and it's beautiful. All of these designs, intricate patterns, beautiful clouds and paintings and things like that. And then he says, wow, this is amazing. I can't imagine how anyone could top it. He has the divider removed between the two screens and then looks at the Greek side of the room, which is just polished to a mirror surface. And in that mirror, he sees everything that's in the Chinese side of the room, but it looks even more beautiful in the mirror. And he sees himself and the painters and outside the windows and everything. And it's just the most beautiful sight he's ever seen. And so he's amazed by this and awards the Greeks the winners. And figures like Ghazali and Rumi and Ibn Arabi have said that the Sufis are the polishers and the kind of ordinary scholars are those who acquire knowledge and kind of paint it on their walls. But the Sufis, their method is polishing the heart through dhikr until all of the wisdom and all of the beauties of reality appear therein. And this is kind of what I think is going on with with what I call transcendent ethics. It's not just the acquisition or the painting on of different virtues and character traits, but rather the polishing to complete reflectivity so that all of the divine traits can appear therein. And this takes place obviously within a particular cosmological context. One other note that's really important here is that this work in particular and the maqāmāt genre in general, like I said, it's kind of heuristic. The actual process of tarbiya, of coming to spiritual and ethical development, is much more like a flower blooming than like putting together an IKEA chair or a Lego set. There are a lot of other schemas, complementary schemas that describe the spiritual path or the path to spiritual realization. Nevertheless, these texts are used to not only describe, but also prescribe and inscribe these kind of spiritual transformations. So sometimes disciples or teachers will identify using these texts which stage or station they think a disciple is and assign particular practices to them based on that stage. So while they shouldn't be taken as, oh, this is a step-by-step manual to realization, they are used in this way to not only describe the path to ethical perfection, but also to prescribe certain practices and to kind of locate oneself along this kind of never-ending path towards the what I call the impossibly possible goal of imitating the prophet, of prophetic perfection. All right, I think that's where we'll end it for now. I really look forward to your questions or comments. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Ogunnaike. Perhaps if you can, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and quite extensively as well, taking the time to take us through the different steps, and then later telling us that we should not have these steps, or at least the steps should always constantly moving around as you showed. So I'll open the floor for at least a Zoom for questions and comments. I already have one from Professor Mariam Al-Attar. I'll ask her to open the questions. Professor Al-Attar, please go ahead. You can just unmute yourself and then.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. But I had a question. I wonder if the professor have come across, I'm sure he did, about Ibn Arabi when he talks about the attributes of the divine, and there are like the attributes of majesty and the attributes of beauty. So when you talked about al-takhalluq bi akhlaq Allah, the beginning of your lecture, I'm like into studying like the foundations of morality in Islam. And when I look into the Sufi tradition, it's kind of seems to me like altogether mysterious, kind of, it cannot be explained in a way that people who are not that mystical, not that Sufi could understand. But when we look at the divine attributes of majesty and divine attributes of beauty, and then maybe one can think of founding morality on the attributes of beauty rather than the attributes of majesty. So I wonder if you can like tell us a little bit more, maybe Tijani, or did he talk about that?
No, I mean, so with Ibn Arabi, but even earlier, even theological writers, no, it's not about the attributes of beauty are good, and that's the foundation of morality. Rather, the foundation of morality for all of these authors, even the Mu'tazilis, is the divine nature itself. The divine nature itself is good and is the source of goodness, and that which, depending on the perspective you have, but amongst the philosophers and the philosophical theologians, that which is most in conformity to the divine nature is that which is the best. So the attributes of majesty include things like justice, which in any philosophical formulation of ethics is either a cardinal virtue or the balance amongst all the virtues. But either way, it has to be there. But you know, meeting God as the just is a terrifying proposition for most Muslims. If we got what we deserved, that's a terrifying thing. So we like to think of rahma and these other things. But the foundation for ethics in like all ethical thought, whether philosophical ethical thought, kalam ethical thought, or in Sufi ethical thought, is the divine nature itself. Now, they take different approaches to that in terms of the divine nature being ordered and structured and reasonable and logical. And then amongst the kind of the philosophical thinkers and certain schools of kalam, then they reason ethics through as a basis of that. Amongst the Asharis, it's more kind of voluntarist. So ethics is you just do whatever God wills, and whatever God says is good, and that's it. And amongst the Sufis, it's ontological continuity with the divine reality, which I don't think it's impossible for people to understand. It's just, I mean, look, people spend loads of time reading and trying to figure out what the heck Deleuze and Guattari and Derrida are talking about. You can do the same thing with the school of Ibn Arabi and Qunawi. Ibn Arabi is a particularly difficult writer for reasons we can get into later, but the later tradition, Qunawi, Qaysari, and others, I mean, that was the basis of a lot of the Ottoman madrasa system. A lot of later kalam has loads of Ibn Arabi influence in it as well too. It can be talked about, it can be discussed rationally, it can be understood to a certain extent. Obviously, these things like mushahada, you can talk about it, you're never going to fully kind of like know what it is without the direct experience, but it can be talked about and discussed discursively, as it has been for 800 some years. Ibn Arabi's direct student Qunawi had this long correspondence with Nasruddin Tusi. It's kind of the main Avicennan champion, and they found common ground, and they agreed and disagreed about many things, including ethics. And they found some common grounds, particularly with the philosophical notion of tashabbuh billah, becoming godlike, and the Sufi notion of takhalluq bi akhlaq Allah. For both of these schools, the philosophical schools and the Sufi schools, it's being like God. That's the foundation of ethics. So the divine reality, the divine nature, which for the Sufis and for the philosophers is just the nature of being itself, that's the foundation of morality and ethics, is just the very nature of being itself.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive answer. Thank you.
I think you're muted,
I have
Professor.
to unmute myself. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't see that. because there's a bit of traffic going around where I'm sitting. Andrea, please go ahead. Oh, I think he's stepped out.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Oludamini, I am really amazed by, I know this book, and once in a while I've made like very brief references to some quotes there, but I would have never tried to summarize it. It's not particularly long, but it is very dense, and would have never tried to summarize it in 50 minutes. But you did an incredible job, and especially the diagram that you did I'm really amazed. So thank you so much for that contribution. I'm still to read the paper. I haven't read the paper as such. But my question was perhaps trying to see if it's possible to also move part of the discussion towards more practical ethics, because we have the sense clearly from your presentation that this is not about, it's about transcendental ethics as you've described it, and it has to do with a specific process of dealing with one's soul.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other writings by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse or other Tijani authors that perhaps might not deal entirely with ilm al-akhlaq as such, but might give some hints of the presence also of some practical ethics in the Tijani tradition, of which Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse is a representative. Part of Ruh al-Adab on etiquette, of course, much of it has to do with etiquette of the Sufi path, but there are also hints about what a practical ethics of the follower of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse might have been, or in the Rasail, in the collection of letters by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, we find hints. And so I wanted to ask you if you also wanted perhaps to share with the audience a couple of examples from that other literature to give them a sense of the fact that there is also that dimension, and also to ask you whether you are thinking of perhaps writing a full book on Sufi ethics, where these dimensions of a more esoteric or transcendental ethical process and of a more practical one can be somehow integrated. Sorry for being long, but that's my question.
I'm so glad you asked this, because when you get into all this highfalutin talk, you forget when you actually read the treatise, the majority of the treatise is describing these different states. And the majority of the different states that they're describing have very, very practical things that you're doing the things that are mustahab, certain ethical things, taking care of the sick, the young, the old, the parents, they're just kind of said in one sentence. But if you were to actually try to follow what you're told to do in this treatise, it's a very rigorous, practical regimen. Moreover, and this is, you see this earlier in Sufi ethics, but it really becomes prominent with Ibn al-Arabi, and afterwards, there's the kind of bringing together, as he said, of the very highest and the seemingly very lowest. So things like giving someone, giving zakat, or even sadaqah, giving charity. You're advised to give charity every day in pretty much every major Sufi ethical writing. But it's the way in which that's completely reformulated is of returning to a particular manifestation of God, what its due is. So it's not me, Professor Ogunnaike, giving some poor person on the street something because I see that they're in need, but rather that poor person on the street is a particular manifestation of the divine reality that has a haqq over me for that money in my pocket or for something else that has to go there. So there's a lot of practical ethics on both the individual level, from everything, like you said, in Ruh al-Adab, in terms of how you interact with your teachers, how you interact with your classmates, with your friends, with your family, humility, silence, all of these other things that you're supposed to keep, but then also social interactions. And then even at a higher level, like larger social things, you could even say political responsibilities that you have as well too. So Sufi ethics sometimes gets characterized as, oh, it's just people off in a cave listening out with their prayer beads, No, it's the exact opposite. In the history of West Africa, African Islam and Sufism, for example, is full of this. You have some people who would go off in a cave and pray, but for the vast majority of the Sufis, they were deeply involved in their societies. They fomented all kinds of social and spiritual movements. They taught people. They were mixing it up in various forms in the political arenas and things like that. And all of that was seen as part of following in the Prophet's footsteps, part of this path of ethical perfection. So there's a lot of practical ethics even in this treatise. And then if you go to the broader literature of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and the Tijani tradition in general, there's so much on how you greet somebody, how you offer someone a cup of water, what you say when you eat, how you eat. So there's very, very detailed practical ethics at the individual level, at the kind of family, small social level, and at the larger social level as well too. No, I'm not planning to write. I have too many planned things already, but you would, I also think, be perfectly placed to write such a book. If you want to write the book on Sufi ethics, there is a really good this paper comes from a very nice edited volume on Sufism and ethics, edited by Bilal Orfali and Atif Khalil. That's published by AUB, which is really good. I mean, it has everything from early Sufi writers, Fakhruddin Razi, to I think there's even articles about contemporary 21st century figures. And it's a really nice collection.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Professor Taiwo, I think you have to unmute again. Sorry.
Yeah, you will probably see my lips moving. So yeah, I've recognized two questions there. Let me go to them and try to keep it the questions and the responses brief. Not that I want to limit it too much, but let us at least Professor Ogunnaike has a lecture coming up in half an hour. So Shahid, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. That was, my name is Shahid, anthropologist of Muslims in India. Fascinated by your talk and also the way you situate this thing. So I understand that. But I also gather from you, it's almost like you want to say that the way that virtue ethics has a kind of a teleology and a fixed set of content. I understand you're saying that in the Sufi ethics that you're discussing, that's just one stage of it. It's not like the actual end of this whole thing. It's like actually a lower form, and you want to focus on this question of nothingness. So I'm wondering, like, would you say that this kind of taking seriously this kind of ethics, or this idea of this nothing, which is both an end and can't be an end because it's because it's not there, is something that maybe is what is it doing? Or maybe my argument, my question is actually betraying our own kind of modern epistemology, where we think always instrumentally. So in a way, I'm thinking that you actually, in a way, showing that so much of the modern ethical tradition can't understand. Actually, we can't relate to a radical kind of critique of instrumentalism that is relentless and kind of ongoing. I don't know what to think about, because it seems to me that as much as there's a goal, there's also this constant critique of it.
Yep, absolutely.
Anyway, this is just a question. Yeah.
So no, I think that's absolutely right. It's explicit in Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi even says that the person who has a particular goal is limited by that goal. So the person's himma or aspiration is attached to that particular goal. And because that particular goal is formed in their mind, their particular goal and their particular ethical, moral, and spiritual development is limited by that goal, which is a single fixed thing. But God is beyond any such single fixed conceptual construction or particular goal. And so they become limited by the goals. He said, but the perfect among people, these Muhammadans, have no goal. They, instead of having a from and a to, they move in a circular kind of orbit around the divine reality, witnessing its tajalliyat, its radiances, its manifestations. So there's a kind of perpetual critique of goals and instrumentalization within this tradition of Sufism, going back to Ibn Arabi and I think even further. But I mean, it does have practical implications. So there's one story that Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and his disciples tell where his it's two stories combined in one. So anyway, there's the story is that and from the Sirah of the Prophets, when the Prophet's wife Aisha was preparing a gift to give as sadaqah to someone, and she wrapped it up nicely and perfumed it, and the Prophet said, "Oh, why are you doing all that?" And she said, "Oh, because I know it's the hand of God that's going to be receiving this gift." And they said, "Oh, you understand this very well." And so, in Sheikh Ibrahim's community, his children and some of his closest disciples, when they would give charity and do things like this, they would understand it and, according to their own accounts, even experience it as it's the hand of God that's giving and it's the hand of God that's receiving. And this is not something that's limited to West Africa. There have been some cool anthropological studies done on like South Asian construction workers in South Asia and in the Gulf, just kind of about their ethics. And without ever saying Ibn Arabi, the word, the name Ibn Arabi, they describe this kind of Akbari ethics of kind of transcending the self and God working through you and God being the recipient of these things, because the Akbari tradition was really super influential in the poetic traditions of Asia and came to be how a lot of people learned this kind of ethics, this adab and akhlaq. So this perspective is, I think, pretty widespread, particularly among Sufi groups, but even at kind of the folk level in villages and places like that. This kind of ethical perspective it's not just a West African Sufi thing. You find similar things around the world. And even though it's not necessarily completely concerned with practical consequences, it does have practical consequences. The particular way in which you formulate your ethical goals will also determine how you get there and how you pursue them.
Very much. We have now Jibril Alau. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I really just wanted to say Jazakumullahu khaira. Sidi Oludamini is someone I've really loved and admired for many years now, and it's the first time I actually meet him face to face, somehow virtually. And every time when I think Mustafa visited you a few years ago, I asked him to send salam, and I really just wanted to say salam alaikum and thank you so much for everything you've done for this deen, for Islam, Iman, Ihsan. May Allah continue to increase you in all that sector. Jazakumullahu anna kulla khair. And Sidi, salam alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh as well, and Sidi Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a mouth to speak. You've been very busy yourself, Sheikh Jibril, mashallah. Big fan of you and all of your works too.
Okay, we have a space for question. One more question from Abu Bakr Karolia from Johannesburg. So while is getting on, let me perhaps come back to some of the meta questions that you sort of raised as such. Perhaps I have a question about, so, I mean, is there value in actually reflecting on these questions by, saying there is something called ethics, or, whether it is ethics in the English tradition or modern tradition, or whether it is in akhlaq as such, is there, I mean, I know that you didn't agree with the kind of whether it is the virtue ethics or the consequentialist, but just the concept, some people think of modern positions and ethics as a critical location. But if one doesn't want to accept the idea of there being a critical position, what is the value of the word itself? What is the value of reflecting on the fact that there is something called ethics, and then even if it means one has to then go beyond ethics as such? And then maybe my second part of the question was that in your paper, for example, you speak about the stations, and then also in a very similar way, in the way that you demonstrated in your presentation, how these stations come and sort of overcome themselves. Mm-hmm. But I was just wondering whether those stations themselves begin to speak about some kind of a reflective, self-reflective position, which then turns away again. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about still holding on to this idea of ethics as perhaps a useful, but as a heuristic device, at least. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I think you kind of answered your own question there. I think yes, absolutely. The stations are represent literally the stations, the places where one stands, where one can reflect on oneself, on reality, on God, on one's relationship to God. But the stations, as you said, transcend themselves, or rather they should in this vision of, and I think the same is true of the category of ethics itself. Ethics is a useful category, just like the stations are useful categories to explain things, to help orient yourself, they serve all kinds of useful practical functions, but the function of a ladder is to be climbed, right? The function of a car is to take you somewhere. So the function of ethics is to take us to ethical being, to actually embodying the virtues, excellence, and in this view, even going beyond individual, like a wonderful self. So I compare in the paper the way in which a lot of virtue ethics and modern ethics is talked about. It's almost like these exercise regimes. So you go on this diet, you do these crunches, and then you get a nice body. You get six-pack abs and muscles and this kind of thing. But Sufi ethics is really about becoming transparent. It's like becoming an invisible man. So it's not about developing, although the development of traits is part of that process, but it's ultimately kind of transcending visibility. And so I think the category of ethics itself is useful to move beyond itself, just like each of these stations are useful to move through them to kind of move beyond them. So I think that's a brilliant observation, and that's exactly what I was trying to argue.
Okay, I have one more comment, but I'm going to ask Abu to come in. Right. Please go ahead, Abu. You have to unmute yourself. You should unmute yourself.
There you are.
Abu.
I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor. Thank you so much for this wonderful topic on ethics and Sufism. I just wanted to ask you a question in terms of what is contemporary ideas of ethics within Sufism. And I actually want to deal with what the Quran have to say in terms of what is the ruh and the nafs. I'm talking about the ruh in terms of what is the idea that knows God, and nafs, what is the earthly domain of how we deal with the issue of trying to move, to use that particular concept to almost make it a kind of slave in terms of what is ethics, in terms of moving to the ruh. Shouldn't we simplify the idea of ethics in terms of how we see Allah or we see God? And, you know, even Ibn Arabi eventually simplified it to say only God exists. I mean, he dealt with all of these ideas of knowledge, and then he came with the concept of wujud. So we have to know Allah with our true self. To know yourself is to know Allah. I say to know your true self is to know Allah. So the ethical value of the nature is intrinsic in the value of knowing God in terms of what ethics means and the behavior means. And this, in my opinion, is the entire aspect of what you say and talked about, and I loved what you said. But we have to simplify it for the modern times. I mean, you deal with the entire process, but how do we actually speak to the mind of the youth, and speak to the mind of the nature, speak to the mind of people that maybe want to deal with their own idea of transcendent and transformation from the nature of ourselves? What do you think about that?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So I think this text is being taught widely throughout West Africa and being used in translation. It's being taught to the youth. It's like, now they're not comparing it to Foucault's ethics like I'm doing in the paper, right? But it's pretty, if you actually have a look at the text itself, it's pretty simple, and there's loads of filled with verses, basically commentaries upon Quranic verses. The whole thing is built upon Hadith Jibril and commentaries upon verses of the Quran. So yes, truth is simple, ethics is simple, but people are complicated, right? And because people are complicated, as people get more and more complicated, they need more complex answers and things like that to deal with the problems and the issues that they have, which is why you have this long tradition of development of different answers. So yeah, truth is simple, ethics is simple, but people are complicated, and because we're complicated, we need complicated answers. And so this, in terms of ethical treatises, in some ways, this is, I mean, it's very dense, but it's very short. It's very compact. In some ways, It's simple. In terms of the nafs and the ruh, yeah, Sheikh Ibrahim and other, like I mentioned, the scheme of maratiba of not the different levels of the soul. There are other schemas of describing kind of journey to ethical perfection in those terms, and it's usually about integration. It's about integration of the body with the nafs, with the qalb, with the aql, with the ruh, with the sir, with the akhfa, with the khafi and the akhfa. Like there are all these different schemas, but it's about the integration of all these different levels of our being together, so that we don't have our bodies running off and doing one thing, our nafs running off and doing another thing, but rather it's an integration of these highest levels of our being, which are understood to be very close to God, with the more distant or seemingly distant levels of our being. So yeah, that perspective is there.
Thank you so much, Professor. I hope to chat with you, I'm sure, soon together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to thank you for participating, and I can, because of the fact that I'm looking at the time, I think our conversations have to continue, and I hope to continue that in a few weeks' time. But for the moment, I would like to thank you for sharing your time and your presentation with us, and and also particularly sharing the paper as well. And thank you all of you for attending and for also joining in the conversation right now. I know that you have to get to a class, so I think I'm going to. I don't see any other hands up right now. I have a question, but I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave it for another time. All right. When we can continue the conversation. Okay, all so right. Yeah. So thank you so much,
everyone, for your time and for your lovely questions and participation. And please, if you have any other thoughts, I'm always trying to improve. Like the ethical journey is endless. So please help me continue to improve this. If you have any comments, please email me. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.